Good morning. This is the second Sunday now that we have been in lockdown, unable to assemble as the church because of the coronavirus. And we are all learning a lot about life and about how important relationships are and what we mean to each other. And so, as promised, I'm going to just give us a little opportunity to open up our Bibles and think about some important things related to the coronavirus and us and God. So I'm going to just begin by reading Psalm 91. I know a lot of people have posted portions of Psalm 91 but I really do believe that it was given to us for our instruction, for our encouragement. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you may find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that wastes at noonday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will only look with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked, because you have made the Lord your dwelling place, the Most High, who is my refuge. No evil shall be allowed to befall you, no plague come near your tent. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot. Because he holds fast to me in love, I will deliver him. I will protect him, because he knows my name. When he calls to me, I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him. With long life, I will satisfy him and show him my salvation. The Psalms are particularly useful in times like this. My Hebrew professor in seminary has written a 2-volume commentary on the book of Psalms. And as we open those pages, he writes a little bit about what the Psalms are. It says it is impossible to express adequately the value of the book of Psalms to the household of faith. For approximately 3,000 years, Psalms have been at the heart of the spiritual life of the people of God. The array of prayers, praises, hymns, meditations, and liturgies in the collection cover all the aspects of living for God in a world that is antagonistic to the faith. In Israel, the collection of the Psalms formed the hymn book of the temple, with many psalms being designated for regular use on certain days and at different occasions, including festivals and holy days. For early Christians, the Psalms were also treasured because of their value in the prayers and praises of the people, but more so because of their application to Christ in the writings of the New Testament. The Psalms are valuable as the people of God worship and come before Him. We are living in fearful times. I don't need to tell you that living on this planet has always been a dangerous place. I know that we are dealing with something unknown, something new, something that is wildly spoken of on the media, social media and television, and the results are we can be living in constant fear. But this is not new. Most of you probably know by now that viruses and plagues have been part of our world for a long time. I can just name a few, not necessarily in order or severity, but you'll probably recognize the Black Plague, the smallpox epidemic, the polio epidemic, HIV virus, the Spanish flu, SARS, MERS, and now the coronavirus, COVID-19. That's the new one on the block. And so we're all trying to deal with those. But there have been many other things that have happened over the history of the world that have affected human life. I can think of wars, and millions of people lost either as soldiers in combat or as civilians. There have been plagues, there have been famines, there have been earthquakes and floods and tornadoes. There have been droughts, all through the history of the world as we know it. And so it really is a dangerous place to live. And I think that's why in the scriptures we have such wonderful promises from God, knowing that we are prone to fear, prone to be afraid. And so I was just going to share real quickly a couple of my own stories about fear. Most of you know that I grew up with claustrophobia, and so I didn't like elevators. I still don't like crawling under my house. I don't like tight places. I want to be able to get out and get away, and I don't like to be trapped. I don't like MRI tubes and all that stuff. You guys have heard that story before. I also remember a time when I was a younger kid, and my brother and I were dropped off at some kind of a play field in the middle of downtown Seattle. And my parents were going to go together down to a furniture store and do some shopping for furniture. And so they thought we probably would get pretty bored, so they gave us baseball gloves and a baseball and bat and frisbee and football, and they said, you guys just play here and we'll go shopping for furniture and then we'll be back. And so that was great for a while. But after a while, I had the feeling inside, the emotion inside, that my parents should be back by now. And then on top of all of that, some kind of emergency vehicles were roaring by the park, an ambulance, and my mind became flooded with fear. And I thought something had happened to my parents, and that was why they hadn't come back to pick us up. Of course, it was unfounded, but I remember the emotion of fear. I remember one other emotion when I was in junior high school. Maybe you can identify with it. In the 60s, of course, it was the height of the Cold War, and the threat of nuclear exchange, nuclear attack was very real. And I remember in junior high school, they decided that we really needed to know about this and know how to duck and how to get for cover and all of that. But they also showed the incredible devastation that could come from a nuclear attack. And honestly, it just frightened me. It scared me to death. And after that day, I was walking home from junior high, many blocks to our house, and I still remember the emotion, the fear of just uncontrollable fear that this might happen, and I didn't have the context to be able to understand fully what was going on. So, of course, when I got home, my parents provided some of that context, and they provided comfort, and I soon was able to kind of carry on with life, but the fear was real. And those of us that know the Lord know that we need to go to Him for comfort and context because He's the Creator. And so I think that that's where Psalm 91 will lead us. It will lead us to the Lord, the one who loves us and the one who made us and the one who understands our proneness to be afraid. So in these days of fear, it's not a big deal to be afraid. Let me just provide a little bit of context for Psalm 91. Dr. Ross entitles this psalm, Secure in the Shadow of the Almighty. And he writes, in times of danger that far exceeds ordinary threats to life and represents the power of evil in the world, even believers can be shaken and live in fear. This psalm was written to provide the people of God with assurance that they would be kept safe and secure if they put their trust in the Lord and remained faithful to the covenant. But so many kinds of things can happen to people, and so it is difficult for everyone to accept these promises, especially if people have endured great suffering already. To some, the psalm seems to be unconvincing or naive in its promises. And yet, the psalmist does not diminish the promises of God, for that would call into question not only the word of God, the word of the Lord, but also His nature. And so the psalmist writes, and we, along with people of faith for many centuries, can enter into the promises that are given in Psalm 91. The first part of the psalm is verses 1 through 13, and that section is very similar to other wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, other Psalms, and Job. And then when we get to the very end of the psalm, it's more of a prophetic oracle of God's presence and protection for His people. So let's just look for a minute at the first two verses. I've already read those, but let me just read it again. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. So the first thing I think that the psalmist wants us to get here is that our focus needs to be on God, on the Lord. Our trust is in Him. Our trust is not in science, ultimately. Our trust is not in politics and politicians. Our trust is not there. In ancient days, people would wear an amulet around their neck, or they had charms and they put their trust there, or they would carve an idol out of wood and they would bow before this man-made idol that was nothing. But the psalmist is reassuring us that there is safety and security in the presence of the Lord God Almighty. And to make it crystal clear, he uses 4 different names for God to make the point. The first name is the Most High. It's El Elyon, the Supreme One, the one in the place of highest authority. He is the one who occupies the highest place. There is no one higher than Him. He is the Most High God. It's the same one to whom Nebuchadnezzar referred when he finally came to his senses and in humility bowed before God, and he gave worship to the Most High, the Creator, who is sovereign over all things, the Most High. And and even in Psalm 57 that I read last week, where the psalmist cries out almost the same kinds of words, "Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge, till the storms of destruction pass by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness." Here the psalmist said, I cried out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. And so the first way that the psalmist talks about God is he's the Most High. Secondly, not only does he occupy the place of highest authority, but he also is the most powerful. When we get to the word Almighty, Shaddai, he is the God of Israel with absolute power. Nothing is impossible to him. Nothing is impossible for him. And we can call out to him, and we can know that we are speaking with, we are calling out to a God of infinite power. And if there's anything we need to remember in these days, is that when we're afraid and we call out to God, we are calling out to a powerful God, the Almighty. He is the most powerful. In Revelation 1:8, we read, I am the Alpha and the Omega, who was and who is to come, the Almighty, the Pantocrator, the one who holds all things in his hand. So he's the Most High. He is the Almighty. Of course, he is Yahweh or Jehovah. That is the personal name for God who entered into covenant with the nation of Israel. He is Yahweh. He is the one who led the children of Israel, the Hebrews, out of bondage in Egypt and entered into a covenant relationship with them and gave them his law and gave him this unilateral covenant. He is Yahweh, and he's also God. He is Elohim. So the psalmist is just making it crystal clear where our faith needs to rest. It's not in us, it's not in other people, it's in the Lord himself. So it says, the one who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. That idea of dwelling means to lodge, it means to reside, it means to sit down and to stay seated in the shelter of the Most High. Now I'm going to be really honest with you. When I was younger, I didn't like early mornings very much at all. I preferred to stay up late at night, and then I would struggle to get out of bed in the morning. But now my favorite time in the day is early in the morning before the sun comes up. And I love to grab a cup of coffee and sit in my chair and sit down and stay seated in the shelter of the Most High to spend time with the Lord, to spend time in prayer, crying out to God, calling out to God for my wife and for my children and their spouses and my grandkids and the rest of my family and my church family and our nation and our community. I love to dwell in the shelter of the Most High. And so the promises that we have is for the one who chooses to dwell there, to sit down and stay seated in the presence of God. In our busy lives, it's really hard to do that. It's really hard. We get so distracted with everything under the sun, but the Lord invites us to come into his throne room and to spend time in his presence. And so it says, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. The psalmist then makes this really clear that this is personal to him. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. So this whole experience of God's protection is for the one who is personally trusting in the Lord. And that's what makes them a child of God. And then the next section, verses 3 through 13, can be summarized this way. Those who trust in the Lord need not fear, because he has entrusted them to his angels. So in verses 3 through 8, we see that the Lord protects the faithful from every terrifying danger. Now, do we experience heartache? Do we experience struggle? Do we experience painful, difficult things? Absolutely. I've lived long enough to know that those who trust in the Lord are not exempt from pain. And they're not exempt from sorrow, and they're not exempt from frustrations, and they're not exempt from financial struggles. And so this is not a psalm that just says, trust in the Lord and everything will be perfect in your life and he will shield you from everything. It's really far from that. I think it's more that the Lord will be with us in the middle of our struggles and in the middle of our pain, much like the disciples who were in the boat with the Lord on the Sea of Galilee, and a big storm arose, and the wind and the waves came, and the water was coming into the boat, and those that were professional fishermen were afraid, and they were afraid of being capsized and drowning, and yet there was the Lord in the back of the boat, and he was asleep. And I think that that's a huge, wonderful picture for us, that when the water is pouring in over the sides of the boat and the winds of life are howling against us, in the middle of the storm, the Lord is with us there. He's with us. And he will never leave us nor forsake us no matter what. So to me, that's very, very encouraging. So let's look at the psalm again. Beginning with verse 3, it says, "For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler," the bird hunter, the net or the snare that a bird hunter would use to surprise suddenly a bird. He will deliver you from that trap. And he will deliver you from the deadly pestilence, which could be a plague, a virus. It could also be, because the words in Hebrew are similar, it could be the deadly words, slanderous words of an enemy. Either way, it says that he will deliver you. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. That just means that there's a place of safety in the wings, under the feathers of the Lord Almighty. Now, I'm no great chicken farmer, but we have had our share of baby chicks and hens and chickens running around our yard over the years. And we have learned that there are also owls and eagles and hawks that would like to swoop down and devour baby chicks. And we've learned how you don't mess with mama hen, because she has an eye for her chicks, a protective eye. And so the imagery that the psalmist is using, I think, is that kind of imagery where, number one, there will be protection for those baby chicks under his wings, under his feathers. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. He's faithful. He can be depended upon because of his character. And then it says, you will not fear of the terror of the night. I can imagine a baby chick under the wings of her mother when owls are flying around at night looking for a snack, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness. Now that may be more of a virus, of a sickness, of a disease, nor the destruction that wastes at noonday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will only look with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked. Now that, to me, just sends me right back to Exodus chapter 12. And you can go there if you'd like, individually or as a couple or with your family. Go back and read about the plagues and about the interchange between Moses and Pharaoh. Let my people go. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Let my people go so that they might go out into the wilderness and worship the Lord, Yahweh. And Pharaoh hardened his heart and said no, and this went back and forth and back and forth. And through Moses, there were the plagues, the 10 plagues. You know, there was turning the Nile River into blood. There was flies. There were frogs. There was darkness. There was sickness. And eventually there was death. And the death was the final straw, the last of the 10 plagues, when finally God hardened Pharaoh's heart. He said no, and God stepped in judgment against Pharaoh and against the nation of Egypt. And so you have the account of the Passover, when God instructed the fathers in each household to slay a lamb and to dip hyssop into the blood of the lamb and smear the blood on the doorposts of the homes of the Hebrews in Egypt. And as they obeyed, as they did what God commanded them to do, we have an amazing sentence in Exodus chapter 12. So in your study, if you would like to go back and read that, that would be great. But it says, the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So it's a picture of God's protection from the recompense of an idolatrous nation. And there was the promise that nothing would happen to them on the night of the Passover, but there's also the promise for the believer, the one who trusts in the Lord, deliverance from God's terrifying events. It says, because you have made the Lord your dwelling place, the Most High, who is my refuge, no evil shall be allowed to befall you, no plague come near your tent. Now, how is God going to pull this off? This is mystery. This is not something I can just explain and say, this is exactly it. I think the spiritual realm is mysterious to human beings. We don't know all that there is to know about heaven and about the angelic beings and their role. We know a little bit. But it says in verses 11 and following, for he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot. He will command his angels concerning you. I don't know how that works exactly, except that angels are messengers. They do the bidding of God. They carry out his will and his wishes. And there is in this psalm a promise of angelic, powerful, supernatural protection at the hands of angels. And maybe you have a story or two about this. I don't like to make big statements that are not necessarily true. But there was one time in the life of my wife and I when we really felt like there was some sort of angelic visitation and protection. And it was one day when my wife was driving her car down the driveway. She was headed for the store, and so she backed the car out of the driveway and alongside of the highway in front of our house. And our daughter Alicia was just a toddler at the time, and as she just followed my wife down the driveway, and my wife didn't know she was coming. And so as Kathy backed out beside the road, she was ready to put her foot on the accelerator at the moment when Alicia was walking in front of her. And all of a sudden, she looked in her rearview mirror just to check out the traffic coming down the hill, and there was a car that pulled in right behind her and stopped. And that made Kathy stop, put on her brakes, and she was wondering, I wonder who that is. And so she didn't put her foot on the accelerator at that moment. And Alicia kept walking, and she walked around the car, between the car and the road. And about that time, a big log truck came roaring down the road. And so Kathy was able to reach out and grab Alicia probably by her hair, pull her over by the door of the car, and keep her from danger. And when that was over, Kathy looked back, and there was no car behind her. There was no one there. And she had no idea. And our only explanation is that somehow God had chosen to protect our daughter from being run over. And, we don't know for sure, but this passage seems to say that protection comes from the Lord, and He will command His angels, His messengers concerning you, to guard you in all your ways. So it's a little glimpse into how God operates, isn't it? And then we come to the very last part, verses 14 through 16. And in those verses, the Lord promises to meet the needs of believers and bless them with a long life through salvation, through deliverance. Now, of course, that is a very clear promise in the Scriptures. The promise to deliver believers, the promise to answer the prayers of a believer. He will bless them with long life through salvation. It's just an amazing set of promises or proclamations about God. It says, because He holds fast to me in love, I will deliver him. I will protect him because He knows my name. When he calls to me, I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him. With long life,